today. Let's discuss some of our today's top stories with our Tuesday panellists, William Hague, former leader of the Tories and Foreign Secretary, and Kezia Dugdale, former Scottish Labour leader, both now Times columnists. Good morning to both of you.
Good morning.
Let's talk about Ukraine. We're just hearing from a Ukrainian figure just before there. William Hague, we talked also earlier this morning to Tom Tugendhat, who chairs the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. I asked him a question and he said he couldn't really answer this. Maybe you can. Do you really feel there is a practical difference in the military aid, which is very welcome? We just heard again how welcome it was, where we say, we'll give you an anti-tank missile, but we won't give you a plane. We won't give you a tank. There's this sort of strange offensive, defensive category of weapons. But when you're using a weapon to defend a country, all weapons are defensive, aren't they? Is it not possible for us to get our acts together and give Ukrainians even more hardware than we are doing?
Yes, I think I absolutely can answer that question. We ought to be doing that, sending them some heavier weapons, because you're quite right that often you have to attack in order to defend yourself. In fact, I called for that in the column I wrote in the Times last week, and I'm glad to say there was some movement on that since then. There was a conference of the donor military, the countries that are giving weapons to Ukraine, hosted by our defense secretary last Thursday. And they did agree some changes to this, including potentially sending some Soviet-built tanks to Ukraine. That's because they know how to operate those tanks already. And sending some artillery, longer-range missiles, and so on. We don't know all the details of what was discussed, and there's perfectly good military reasons not to advertise all those things. But there does seem to have been a change there, and I think we just heard the description of the battle that is coming in the east, in the Donbass, and that continues to rage around Mariupol. And the Ukrainians do need to sustain a conflict which might last a long time, and they do need some of those heavier weapons.
What's delaying it then, William? Because you could make this argument that I understand that we don't want to engage President Putin directly. That's the great red line for NATO countries. I do understand that, although I think there are arguments around that still to be made, perhaps. But what's the delay? Because we could have sent MiG-29s a month ago and actually trained people to use them in that time. And we heard actually from Tom Tugendhat, we could actually train them to use American planes in the time that we've been waiting around. Is it a country that's delaying this? Is it the organization of NATO? If you were Foreign Secretary, could you not say, I want to send tanks, I want to send planes to Ukraine tomorrow?
Well, a lot of these things do require agreement of an alliance. In the case of planes, you see, these planes that were going to be provided by Poland, that were taken to a German airbase, a NATO airbase, but to do it requires, in a NATO operation, the agreement of the United States that was not willing to send planes into what might be an instant dogfight with the Russians. So you can't just say, oh, I'm the British Foreign or Defense Secretary and I'm going to do this. There's a lot you can do, but you can't just necessarily fly an air force into Ukraine. It's also important to bear in mind, I mean, I'm on your side, by the way, on the questions you're asking, as you can tell, but just to explain the situation, the initial weapons that were sent, like these very, very effective anti-tank missiles that Britain has sent, and other weapons the United States has sent, these weapons were sent sort of on the assumption that the Ukrainians would be resisting a Russian occupation of a large part of the country, more of the country than they've been able to occupy, more of an insurgency. Well, it's turned out, as we know, the Ukrainian armed forces have performed one of the great feats of history, really, in fighting off the Russian army from Kiev. It is an extraordinary military achievement. So now they need the heavier weapons for a different kind of war than what was being contemplated 6 weeks ago. That's one of the reasons that countries are playing catch-up here.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Kezia, does Bucha change anything? I guess that's one of the questions we've been wrestling with a bit this week so far. You know, we've seen evidence of atrocities. Thankfully, we've got journalists like Catherine Philp from the Times who goes to Bucha, actually looks at mass graves, talks to people, sees evidence of executions, can testify honestly to what has been going on there. But that level of atrocity, that level of war crime, does that change any equation in your mind, or did we was it always sort of factored in? We knew how the Russian army would behave?
Well, if the extent of the horrors and the extent of the atrocities was the only measure by which we decided what armoury or what weaponry to send, then of course it would. But the reality, it's far more complicated than that, as you've just heard William describe. I think the difference that what's happened in Boccia and all of the stories we've heard in the last 10 days of the most atrocious rapes against men, women and children is the extent to which war crimes will be pursued whenever this war actually ends, and the long-term nature of our relationship with Russia. I can't see it ever going back to anything like what it used to be. There will be a long-term cost because of the extent of these atrocities. And I think that's where the price will be paid, rather than the decisions that we take now around what weapons or support that we send.
That's such a good point. That's such a good point. And Louise Callan actually made the point. She thought it would take generations, she was saying, that for forgiveness, for the ability of Ukrainians to look Russians and as representatives of their country in the eye again. People asking questions on YouTube, please do keep them coming in, and we'll put them to our panel. William, this is for you, and this is a hobby horse of mine, which is why I'm reading it out. Peter Green says, do the panel agree that Russia's presence on the UN Human Rights Council is a farce, and should they not at least be suspended from it? I would like to take that further, William, and say their membership of the Security Council is a farce.
Yeah, of course it is. I mean, it's ridiculous, isn't it? However, we don't control the United Nations. The whole point of the United Nations is that every country has its rights there. And the rights of Russia are entrenched in it, like our rights are. So however much we hate that fact, that is the reality. There are the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. Russia is one of them, just like we are, and they have a veto over any really decisive action, which requires a resolution in the Security Council. So the United Nations is not equipped to deal with this. It can only really operate when all those permanent members are in agreement. And obviously, you have neither Russia nor China willing to act as the United Nations.
So it's pointless, then. It's pointless. The 2 bad actors, probably the 2 main bad actors in the entire world, are part of an institution which can veto anything that might deal with bad actors in the world. That feels completely pointless, then, doesn't it?
Well, it's not pointless, of course, but it's not entirely pointless, because the United Nations does deal with a whole range of other things. You know, every day of the week, the United Nations is dealing with something that's going on in passing a resolution about something in stabilizing a country in Africa that has a civil war, this sort of thing. The United Nations is discussing climate change and so on. Those discussions have to go on, even when there's a war. So it's not pointless. But of course, it doesn't fulfill the objective of maintaining international peace and security when one of the leading members of the United Nations destroys international peace and security. And there's never been a way around that other than not having a United Nations. I mean, that's just one of the facts of world politics.
Don't forget, you can watch our conversation on our YouTube channel. You can also post questions there. We'll put them to Kezia Dugdale and William Hague as we go through. Let's talk about Channel 4, because we know that government ministers have decided to proceed with the sale of the channel, though the broadcaster has expressed its disappointment with the decision. The plans to privatise the channel have been confirmed by the Culture Secretary, Nadine Dorries. She's in fact been tweeting about this. Kezia, what do you make of the government's view that this enables Channel 4, a sale will enable Channel 4 to compete realistically with the likes of Amazon and Netflix? It will cast off the shackles and be able to move forward and grow.
I find the whole thing really sad and really disappointing. And let's start with the reality that Channel 4 is not Netflix and it's not Amazon Prime, and it was never intended to be, and it doesn't want to be that now. It plays a completely different role in the ecosystem of British broadcasting. It supports a huge number of independent production companies and allows things to get to air that otherwise would never have a fighting chance, and as a consequence supports a tremendous amount of jobs right across the whole of the United Kingdom, which is a real threat, I think, in this move if Channel 4 is forced to be more commercial, more mainstream than it ever has been in its past. And I'm sad because I think, Channel 4 has always played such an important role in giving voice to minorities and also just operating on the edges of the mainstream, being a little bit edgier. And that, for me, played a really important role, in my youth. It's been a tremendous part of developing LGBT culture, everything from Queer as Folk to It's a Sin. It's given a voice and a space to people that aren't seen or heard on TV in other ways. And I really worry that we'll lose that now in this kind of venture for profit-orientated TV at the expense of everything else.
We spoke to Lucy Powell, the Shadow Culture Secretary, an hour or so ago, and she said she hadn't found a single person who thought this was a good idea. Let's find out if William Hague is that person that we've spoken to this morning. I mean, you're the only Thatcherite on the panel. Privatisation, good thing?
Well, yes, on the whole. I mean, I'm quite. I find it hard to have a strong opinion either way about Channel 4, but on the whole, I'm in favour of private ownership. Yes, and you indeed go back to Thatcher. By the way, I can name plenty of other single period, like the whole cabinet, for instance, that are in favour of doing this. So I don't think it's difficult to find a single person who's in favour of it.
We've struggled this morning because the government didn't put anyone up, to be honest. So that's...
Oh, I see. Oh, well, I'm happy to state their case in their absence, or sort of my version of their case, which is it partly depends what you do with the money. If this raises £1 billion and it's meant to go to support creative industries as part of the levelling up agenda, well, if that's spent effectively, that will be a good thing. It's meant to remain a public service broadcaster, which means that there will be obligations continued to be placed on it, and it will be able to raise more capital as a private company, which does help it to compete in the future. So those are the arguments in favour of doing it. There are good arguments the other way that Kezia has just stated, but on the whole, I favour private ownership when possible.
I'll ask both of you this question. Maybe Kezia, and you first, then William. If Channel 4 News was not a left-wing news outlet in the eyes of many, would we be having this conversation, in your view, Kezia?
No, because I think, as you heard Lucy Powell say earlier, if you're searching for a motive as to why to do this, because it doesn't appear to me to be financial, Channel 4 isn't in any trouble, it doesn't need bailed out in any way. It does seem ideological to me that there's a position being taken at the heart of government that this is a left-wing outlet. And I've been kind of searching my soul about that this morning. Do I think it's left-wing? I mean, I think it's got some of the highest standards of news journalism you can find anywhere in the country. You think of the people that take to the news, like Jon Snow, of the past. These are leading journalists that are respected across the board. Is it the case that Channel 4 News perhaps highlights stories in a different order that other outlets do, and that's what gives it a slightly left perspective? Possibly. Is that a good thing? Yes. I think it's about giving people choice about the news that they consume, and goodness knows we're seeing an awful lot of that. It's shaking up at the moment. We've got new TV channels coming our way that are very much associated with this radio programme. We've got GB News, we've got others. The diversity of news is important. And I don't think it's the role of government to kind of rule that out by selling off a major part of our public service broadcasting service at the moment.
William, is there an ignoble motive here in your view? I saw someone on social media say the government likes to annoy what it considers the right people, and so it does policies that will annoy the right people, and this is one of those.
I think they'd be doing it anyway. I mean, by the way, I'm not sure the news will change. Who knows? I'm not sure Channel 4 News would have to be different drastically, since it will still be a public service broadcast. It will still have to have news bulletins. It will still be able to choose its editorial line within those restrictions. So if their point is to change the news, well, they might be very disappointed. And we are in this new world, as Kezia was just pointing out, of many different sort of news channels arising where people have a choice between them. So I think if that is the government's objective, they might be wasting their time, and they are doing it more for the financial and long-term reasons, I think.
Let's move on. Thousands of British workers will take part in a trial to examine the impacts of a 4-day working week on staff conditions and productivity in what is thought to be the biggest of its kind thus far. 60 companies have agreed to the scheme, managed by academics at Oxford, Cambridge and the University of Boston, and the trial is taking place from June to December. Kezia, is there an unstated truth that we probably all know, that in many jobs, not all jobs, in many jobs, if you got your head down, you could do in 4 days what you're paid to do in 5?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that. I mean, I think William and I have talked about this issue a few times before on this programme. I'm not against a 4-day week. What I am for, though, is more flexible work. And I think the advances in technology mean that most of us, that's an important caveat, most of us can work hours that better suit our lives, therefore match our own productivity levels. And I think that's really the environment that we want to create for people to work in, rather than move from what we've got now to a very kind of rigid 4-day week system. If the focus is on driving up productivity levels, give people more flexibility around when they work best, and then I think you'll get the benefits that you're looking for.
Yeah, I mean, the 5-day week is a strange historical artifact, I would imagine, William. There's no science behind 5 days. It's presumably a bit of Victorian productivity and a bit of biblical studies that's got us to a 5-day working week in the West, at least. So there's no need to cling to it, perhaps.
No, I'm also in favor of more flexible working. And you're right, there's no magic to 5 days. People used to work 6 days on the whole. And I think in Dubai, they've just adopted a 4.5-day week. So there's no magic to the 5 days. Nevertheless, there is a magic. It depends what you want to do in life. It depends what your ambitions are. It depends what stage of life you're at and what sort of job you have. But there is a magic if you're ambitious, if you're young, if you want to really carve out your place in the world. Don't think you're working 4 days a week because you're competing with other people who will work flat out. And, whenever I go and speak to students, what do you want to become? Oh, they want to become whatever. They want to found their own business. They want to be a top lawyer. They want to be an actress. And I say, right, well, you have to work all the time in order to achieve those things, because all the most successful people I know in the world work really hard. So I think it's always important to bear that in mind. The world would not spin around very much if we all worked a 4-day week.
Isn't it also about the danger here that everyone would want the Monday and the Friday off? That's not going to work, is it? You can't have everyone off on a Monday and a Friday. So I guess this kind of 4-day week, Kezia, would have to have a level of flexibility within it.
Well, you've just punctured it, haven't you? It's over. That's it. Well, the reality is, I think people probably would vary the days that they work. I quite often work on a Sunday because my partner is a government minister. She's got a big box to do of government work, so I'll do other things associated with my job, and I've got the ability to do that because of the nature I've got of the nature of the job that I've got just now. And I think if more people could be encouraged to have those flexible arrangements, then I think we'd be happier, more productive. As a consequence of it, why not?
One last question from YouTube. This is the week that the fines have started being issued to civil servants. You can have a view on that, but there's a specific question which I'm no doubt will come back again in the weeks to come. It's a relatively straightforward question. Should Boris Johnson resign if he becomes one of those who this week or next week or whenever get a fixed penalty notice for Partygate? Kezia Dugdale.
So look, I study trust in my day job at the John Smith Centre, and we look at what drives up public trust and what ruins it. And one of the ways to drive it up is that code of conducts and standards are followed. The public expect rules to be followed, and when they're broken, the consequences are paid. So the evidence suggests that the public would expect to see him resign.
William Hague?
My answer to that question is not while there's a war on. And the great thing about that answer is it leaves you guessing as to what my answer would be when there isn't a war on.
Well, I'll tell you what, William, you're stuck here for life, on Times Radio. So there will be a joyous moment for us all when
we'll get round to it in the end.
We will get round to it in the end, because there will hopefully, please God, be a time when there is no war in Ukraine, and then you'll have to answer that question. That'll be one of the many benefits of that situation. William Hague and Kezia Dugdale, thank you as ever for joining us.
It's just gone 9:30 here on Times Radio Breakfast. Let's get the latest news now with Alex Morgan.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.
Chloe, thank you. Good morning. The mayor of Kyiv claims 5,000 civilians have now been killed in the city of Mariupol. The besieged port city has been under constant attack since the start of the Russian invasion 6 weeks ago. Vitaly Klitschko has again renewed his calls for more weapons